When I learned about VANDA going online this year, I was happy as it made my participation possible because I wouldn't consider going to Vienna from Svalbard for environmental reasons. And also, me and Thomas, we cannot miss an overheating panel as it is his and his team's work that makes my current research in Svalbard possible. Behind me you see the site that I will be talking about, and in a while one of my participants, a dear friend and an author of a book that was an important source for this presentation, will join us. The title of the panel reads Living with Changing Environments in an Overheated World. Throughout my fieldwork that started in February last year, I have gathered evidence that Svalbard and Longyearbyen is very much part of an overconnected, warming and shrinking world. What we see here is a deathly level of economic dependence on international mobility, especially travel by air. We also see rising social inequalities due to the economic convenience of the so-called flexible workforce, eased by the loose legal framework of Svalbard's special territorial status. Right now it's difficult to predict the long-term impacts of the pandemic, but before the crisis, the feeling that we are a bit too many and it's all happening too fast was quite widely shared. The town below me is the biggest settlement on the archipelago situated in the high Arctic. It is governed by Norway and has about 2,300 inhabitants. Svalbard attracts international attention of politicians, scientists, journalists and other sorts of visitors willing to witness environmental change. When asked about how they see the environment changing, residents of Longyearbyen speak about less sea ice, warmer weather, permafrost thaw, more precipitation including heavy rain, shorter winter season, retreating glaciers, erosion, landslide and avalanche danger. All in all, it is impossible to ignore that something is happening to the environment, that the landscape and weather patterns we knew once are changing. Outsiders often look at Svalbard as a place where it is happening and believe that people living here are environmentally conscious and engaged, given that the place is impacted so clearly. Yet it is hardly possible to speak about how the community is impacted, as we first need to evaluate whether we can at all speak about the community of Longyearbyen. Together with Vered Amid, I would argue that there is no community here in the anthropological sense of the term, and we rather can talk about various social actors, economic migrants, state employees, students, contract workers, tourist workers, etc., who become part of personal social networks and groups. These networks and groups can, quoting Amid, call into play categorical identities, notions of home, belonging or community, end of quote. Let me add that the turnover is very high here and 64% of the population have lived here for less than 5 years. I will therefore drop the term community and speak about the somewhat disparate worlds of Longyearbyen residents who all see the same changes but who live with them differently. The range of attitudes and perceptions is wide, and unfortunately I don't have enough time to display all the archetypes I have encountered in the field. But for the purpose of this presentation, I have chosen 3 stories of people who can see us as stable in this fluid town. One of a fresh adult, an offspring of Thai economic migrants who came in 2000s and has thus spent most of her life in Longyearbyen. One of a retired Norwegian who, among other places, worked in the coal mine on the island in 1960s and who has spent here altogether more than 30 years. And one of a non-Norwegian but European climate scientist working in Svalbard who first came for fieldwork in 1980s. Quote, "You can see climate change in Longyearbyen very well. When I was little, I remember the ice lying on the fjords. You could go with a snow scooter to the other side. You can't do that anymore. And in the summer, the mountains are green. They've never been before. They used to be brownish or yellow, but never green. And there used to be white flowers everywhere on the meadows, plains, moss. Now they're gone. Where there used to be, there are houses, hotels. The town is growing." End of quote. It is difficult to speak about environmental change without noticing the other changes that go hand in hand. There is no boundary between the world of humans and the world of nature. Parita continues, quote, "I have heard this thing with the permafrost, that when it melts it becomes methane, and that's very dangerous for us. And we know it's melting because if the ground is greener, it means it has melted more. We see that there is less permafrost. It's visible. That's frightening that we can see it. We shouldn't be able to see it. I'm just 18 and I see that the world is going in a direction it shouldn't go. I have this image in the head like a doomsday, like a picture of a world that is totally destroyed. I have it in the head. And if we don't do anything about it, it is going to happen. I'm afraid that the future generations will not be able to experience the beauty that we see now. End of quote. Marita uses the scientific knowledge available to her, translated into plain words that inevitably lead to inaccuracies. But she has a very strong feeling about the changes she's witnessing, and that energizes her and makes her engage. Let's move on to Olaf's world. He calls himself an old socialist, and when asked about the changes he notices throughout his long personal Svalbard history, he speaks with indignation about the privileged position of people employed by the state and how people working in tourism, especially the Asian economic migrants, are being exploited. According to Olaf, the cause is greed. When we try together to trace back where these changes began, Olaf mentions 1990s, when the Soviet Union, a geopolitical enemy present in Svalbard, fell apart, the state loosened control, and the government decided to develop tourism. He sees this direction as a blind alley. When you look at the planet, it is obvious that to move so many people by plane up here, ironic laughter, end of quote. It started quite slow, but then Hurtigruten got involved and the growth accelerated. Olaf says the company is, quote, part of the new world, the new industry, end of quote, where people have to be flexible and there is little possibility to mobilize and stand for one's rights. Perhaps you're now wondering what this has to do with perception of environmental change, but I would like to argue that it is not accidental that the great acceleration of global capitalism, including mobility of people and increase of consumption, is happening parallel to speeded up environmental change. Both processes are caused by externalization of costs. There is always somebody, a group, a species, a landscape, who loses, but whose loss is to boot not taken into consideration or denied. According to Olaf, coal has become unpopular because of the environmental harm of the product itself, while tourism does not mean despicable products, but rather ambiguous secondary impacts in the form of the volume of people who come up by plane and who work in the industry. Quote, the emissions have increased dramatically, end of quote. After the end of the Cold War, Norway was rich, optimistic and eager to develop, Svalbard included. Dropping the coal was perhaps necessary, but opting for tourism only brought the great dilemma of how to become greener, but continue to grow and consume right to Svalbard, which started warming up and melting. Not because of the change that happened locally, of course, but because of the change that happened globally and was translated locally into a fast economic and social transformation. And both environment, economics and society became destabilized and less predictable. But how does Olaf feel about the changing environment? He is terrified by the doomsday mood of many and feels that it, quote, destroys the future, end of quote. He's not skeptical and believes that we people play a role in what is happening, but he's hesitant to draw a direct connection between human behavior and heavy rainfall in Svalbard. He notices that the ground is eroding by the seashore, but brings up the metaphor of cycles that are natural, yet, quote, that we are now in a warm period up here, that is no doubt about. We see that it can be warmer here in the winter than on the mainland Norway, and that's very peculiar, end of quote. He believes that science is important, that a lot can be done about the oceans, that the emissions should be cut. But the change he most feels worried about is the lack of solidarity and short-sightedness of tourism. Kim Holmen is one of the scientists I visited in their offices at the University Center in Svalbard. When asked about what he sees as changing, he simply replies, all of it. People, tourism, research, laws and regulations, climate. Quote, I have feelings about where we should be going. We can shape the future of Svalbard. I see Svalbard as an important player on the global scene, end of quote. Kim speaks about people in power who come to Svalbard to see climate change, and he feels that, quote, we are listened to, so we are very much part of the debate where the world wants to go, where the world can go, and what is happening already that we cannot do anything about. We can teach some of these visitors to think about values and other things than just monetary success, end of quote. In the figure of Kim, I meet the scientist who is aware of the knowledge available, but also of the powers that hinder action, including spreading confusion and doubts. Quote, how do you as an individual or as a group form a coherent picture of the world that you feel secure in? You shut out things. It is attractive to have a simple explanation rather than to weed out this noise of information, end of quote. In a way, anthropology also is a sort of weeding out noise of the data that the ethnographer collects. Kim continues, quote, "We live in a time where people strive to have rational arguments. We have to find the truth, the science should decide. Feelings are maybe irrational, but they're real, and we have to build a society for human beings." End of quote. Kim realizes clearly that to respond with hard data, whatever it is, cannot work if the partner responds with feelings. In anthropology, it is, for example, Nigel Report who asks, together with Ernest Gellner, why anthropology can't, quote, seek an answer to why scientific knowledge was so successful with regards to the domains of nature and technology, but not to culture and morality, end of quote. I want to draw a preliminary conclusion here that perception of environmental change in Svalbard, in spite of the fact that natural science is prominent and vibrant here, is equally varied as anywhere else. Power to come up with measures, make decisions and implement them in the local context is a different story, and I won't have time to elaborate on that now. Neither could I introduce representatives of the other standpoints that I have documented through my conversations. But I would like to open up for one more perception that has been formulated in the title of a non-fiction book published this spring by Line Nagel.
Thank you very much, Zdenka. I moved up here in 2004, fell in love with the place, and I've been working as a journalist since. And I published my first book this spring, and I want to read the start, just to show a little bit of why I felt the need to write this book. Her body is completely stuck. Eliana Ashtal thinks she's lying on her stomach, perhaps under the kitchen table, as her face is crushed against some woodwork. Somewhere in the snow, she hears the 2-year-old wailing. Then everything goes quiet. She thinks that everyone's dead now, her 2 friends and the children, and now she's dying, 33 years old, on the 19th of December 2015. A 2-year-old girl and her father died in their houses this day, just behind us here. The avalanche went from this mountain called Sokolickova. 1 year later, a new avalanche came down from this same mountain and swept through a terraced house. There was a landslide just beside the graveyard, and one which came down into a dog kennel after heavy rainfall in the autumn of 2016. We built a house in this town. I have 2 children and call this place home. And suddenly I started getting worried when bad weather was forecasted. The dark season became especially heavy with a lot of rain, and I invested in this lined raincoat. I wasn't sure whether or not it was safe to walk in the mountains where I usually went. Emotions started to take over, and I felt the need to get a grip, to understand what was actually happening, how nature is connected, how the climate system works, and what will happen with the weather on this group of islands and across the rest of the world, if or when the Arctic melts. Should I stay here, I asked myself. Well, we're still here, and this July was really special. We have to go out and feel it, I say to the kids. It's going to be really hot, maybe warmer than any other day we've experienced in Longyearbyen. My daughter, now 7, opens the door. Her golden hair is whirling in the wind. The wind is warm and thick and smells differently, she says, before she runs out in the street with her hands in the air, only wearing her pajamas. Later this Saturday evening, I walk towards the top of Mount Sokolickova with Eliane, the mountain that sent the avalanche into the house she visited. We're wearing t-shirts, talking about the strange haze. Just below the top, we sit down in the warm tundra. Eliana checks her phone for the latest temperature update. Longyearbyen last 24 hours. Maximum temperature 21.7 degrees Celsius. It's a new record. The heat continues. For the first time, it's warmer than 20 degrees 4 days in a row. We spent 3 of these in an old cabin, far away from people and electricity. One of the evenings we planned to go for a swim, naked like the day we did before. But a shadow is coming in the bay, the cruise ship Roald Amundsen of Hurtigruten. This is not happening, I think. We only go here once or twice a year. 3 years ago, another cruise ship landed with 150 tourists on the beach in front of the cabin. The kids felt invaded. They didn't like the cameras on their faces. We explain to the guides and say we hope they can land on the other side at the old Trappers cabin. They do so, and I'm so grateful. Later, the whole world got to know that this ship's departure was infected by corona. Well, I felt it was wrong to enjoy these beautiful summer days like I did. The glaciers near Longyearbyen melted, the rivers went high, and the coal mine that provides coal for the local power plant was flooded. This is the warmest summer ever measured in Longyearbyen. Since the recording started in 1899, the average temperature was 7.2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees over the normal temperature. Now, a thin cover of snow is lying on top of the mountains surrounding Longyearbyen. The land has expectations of cold and ice, but I fear they won't be fulfilled.
Thank you very much, Line, for agreeing to speak for yourself instead of letting me to speak about you. Before Thomas comments on the presentation live, I want to sum it up briefly. In the figures of Parita, Olaf and Kim, and in the testimony of Line, we can spot a thread that connects the past with the present and stretches to the future of overheated Svalbard. We see that the changes we notice in the physical environment cannot be separated from changes in economic and social structures that we are part of. Neither should knowledge and feelings be studied separately, as what we have been through, what we know, what we perceive, how we feel, and what we wish weave the patterns of our value-laden minds. The melting world is equally mine as yours. Thank you for your attention.